All right. So today's guest we have on the Pat Hoban Development Podcast. We're trying to talk about personal development, business development, and economic development. This topic is again going to be on personal development, similar to last week with Vince. And today we've got Peter Topa, and we'll get into Peter's background and how he started off in his career compared to where he thought he was going to be, compared to where he's at now, and then talk a little bit about where Peter lives now. So with that, if you want to just jump in, Pete, and just, I guess, talk about what you were passionate about when you were in high school.
Yeah. Yeah, that's, it's a while ago. But I think, I wouldn't say a pretty big pivot because everything's pretty insignificant when you look at the grand scheme of things. But when I entered high school, I actually went to a prep school that was about a few hours away from where I grew up. And I had a pretty big transformation of just where I was as a person. I stopped playing sports. I just wasn't good enough. And I really focused a lot of my endeavors on learning music and meeting people that way. But I had to learn and meet a lot of new folks at a brand new school. And I was pretty guarded as a 13-year-old kid. I think some people would be surprised to understand that about me now. But I was pretty shy as a kid.
Yeah, so knowing your personality, that's not you at all.
Yeah. I went to school and it was a pretty interesting experience. For 4 years, really. I had lived with a family that I didn't know my first couple of years. And then my brother and I actually ended up living by ourselves, which was pretty interesting, as you can imagine, a couple of teenagers without, formal parents or anything like that with them. But I was able to keep my grades up for the most part. I was in all honors courses every year. Academics came rather easily to me, and ended up meeting a lot of really good people, a lot of diverse characters, some academics, some musicians, not really any athletes, but we all had a good time.
Very cool. So I like the music scene because I see there's a lot of equipment behind you. Is there one that you prefer over another?
Yeah, I would prefer playing electric guitar in a band, but as a 37-year-old, sometimes that kind of those opportunities are hit or miss. It is still a really big part of my life. I actually a large part of the last 10 or 12 years have been focused around philanthropy, and a way I've really figured out how I can capitalize on my skill set, from a person, from a professional perspective, from a network, and from my own personal interests is I have coordinated probably about 20 concerts over the last 10 years with myself and friends playing, all with raising money. Started in Chicago, just at a small bar with 35 people. And then last year we played a show. Can't remember where in Chicago it was, but there was about, I think, 500 people there. And we raised about $10,000. So it's pretty cool to see that trajectory, raising $200 to $10,000 in a matter of 10 years.
Yeah, that's awesome. I didn't know that at all. I just knew you were a musician because I can't remember what assignment, but you literally created a song for our group and recorded it, which was pretty fun when we were at Notre Dame.
I'm a little upset that about 6 months after that, a hit song came out about Applebee's, which was literally what I wrote a song about.
That is true. Yeah, that is true. I did not make that connection there if you wrote that song. So you could have had some music rights there and been famous. So looking back at high school, what was your transition into college?
Yeah, so college, it was, I went to a school that was pretty close to me, about 2 hours away in Cleveland, John Carroll University. It was a liberal art school. And I got into Pitt, Penn State, and John Carroll, and probably wouldn't have graduated if I went to Pitt. Too many bad influences down there. Wasn't into having a big school experience. Penn State really wasn't my scene. And my brother he was enrolled in John Carroll. And so ultimately decided to go to John Carroll, which once again, not unique or normal, but it, um, puts you into an uncomfortable experience again, rooming with people you don't know, and then making a new round of friends. Fortunately, one of my best friends, he was my roommate for 2 or 3 years at John Carroll, but historically, there's been people throughout my life who, I've kept in touch with. From some of my groomsmen I've known since I was 2 years old. The other was my best friend in high school, and the other was my best friend in college. So, but from a social perspective, it, mirrored a lot of my high school, I would say. But as far as academics, I was kind of all over the place. Originally, I wanted to be a writer and a historian. And my dad was pretty blunt in sharing his opinion about that. And so I transferred into just a marketing degree, which I still think is one of the most useless degrees out there. But I got to where I am with my marketing degree with minors in creative writing, as well as um, international business. And when I was in school, I actually, I'm a type of person who I think 5-10 years ahead. I kind of look at that in my life. And I thought, the world is going one of two places. Two places. It's going to India or to China. And in India, they predominantly speak English, even though there's many languages spoken in the country, but business language is English. And so I decided I wanted to go over and study Chinese. And so I lived in China for about 6 months and studied Mandarin for 4 years with, the intent that I had of being an expat at some date and juncture.
So then, yeah, that's quite an aspiration compared to what you ended up doing. So how did, graduation compared to like the goal of being an expat and looking down the road? Talk about, your first early on career and what that looked like.
Yeah. So, when I came back and when I was wrapping up graduation, it was, in the 2008, 2009, financial crisis. So that was super fun to try to get a job. I think I had realized at that point that the best opportunity would probably be something to go into sales. And I think it's really tough, to figure out what you want to do, but you can look at passion, you can look at finances, you can look at work-life balance, you can look at someplace in between. For me, a lot of things related to financial independence. And I feel like sales for me was the best way to get there because I didn't study accounting. There's a lot of my friends who got jobs that I at the time thought were pretty lucrative, right out of college. And then you realize as you get older, what the market opportunity is, for you to grow your own career, regardless of industry. But my first job, I decided I really didn't want to be pigeonholed into a really low level sales job. So I decided to take an internship actually in South Dakota at a company called Daktronics. And Daktronics at the time was one of the largest competitors in sports arenas, scoreboards. Their main competitors were Panasonic, Mitsubishi, and Sony. So believe it or not, Patrick, I spent 7 months essentially being a truck driver and installing these scoreboards at professional stadiums, running scoreboards. I sat courtside at both the men's and women's SEC basketball tournaments and ran the scoreboards, which was a pretty cool experience. And, I don't think I've been to a basketball game since, but I did that just really to gain experience. And really at the end of that tenure there, they offered me a position and they actually shared that I could move over to Asia in 2 years to be the Southeast Asia sales rep. I had some, which, it's just an unfortunate reality of the world. People will experience all sorts of loss in their life. I had a close friend of mine I had actually several get cancer and battled cancer. And, I just looked at kind of life and I said, I don't want to leave my family until, they've gone on and they've passed. And thankfully, my parents and everything are still alive. But I just made that decision that being an expat, wasn't a priority for me anymore. And after that job, I worked at a Fortune 500 company called Air Products and Chemicals, selling industrial gases, which was really not my cup of tea. But it gave me a lot of skill sets. I cold in East Cleveland and all throughout the Eastern Ohio corridor, which if you're from Cleveland or any really Rust Belt city, the parts of the city that aren't really fun to be in. And there was a lot of manufacturers, metal fabricationers that I sold to. And I'll never forget, the first sale I ever made, pounded on this guy's door of, a fence. There was barbed wire, there was locks on the door, everything. I was walking down the steps to leave because nobody answered. This huge behemoth of a man, probably 6'5", came outside and he was like, "What the hell do you want?" He was not only huge, but he was also 6 steps above me. I gave him my pitch and then he was interested. And a month later, I made the sale with him, which was a really cool experience to do. And then throughout that time period, I knew this job was not for me. I really did not like it at all, but I utilized the technology at the time called Salesforce, which I was like, hey, this is really interesting. I'd saved up some money. I had actually bought some stock in the company. And then about 16 months into my tenure at that company, I applied to a job at Salesforce, just an entry-level job at Salesforce, which was, I thought, a couple steps back. And I think that's where a lot of people mess up in their careers. They never want to take a step back. But I saw the writing on the wall, or at least I credit myself now to. But I got a job at Salesforce as an entry and, was at that company for about 12 years and had about 6 or 7 different promotions in that tenure. And pretty much, from a sales perspective, from a notoriety perspective, couldn't really ask for a better company from a resume perspective and an opportunity perspective than Salesforce for the last dozen years.
So one of the things that I've noticed, like what you're saying, going into, like you mentioned earlier on, like high school wise, going into new school, you weren't there making friends, and somehow you ended up in sales, and you're really good at it. But I also wanted to point out to the listeners out there that you took, it sounded like multiple internships. So it's like, taking a step back, but it got you in the door and created opportunity. And I don't know if that's a standard now, if people are looking to jump right into the workforce. I was the same way. I would take lower paying jobs just to get the experience. So I know it would build from there. So is there something that you would, it sounds like you did it right, but that you would go back and tell yourself at the beginning of your career compared to where you are now? Like what advice would you have to young people?
I think always just keep everything's going to work out. And I know that, some people have a problem when people say that, but there's a few events. Patrick, 5 years ago, you were going through some stuff. Things worked out, right? And nothing's as big of a deal most of the time as you make it out to be then. So, for instance, at the start of that, 2007, 2008, when the crash was happening, I was applying to jobs at Moen, which was a Cleveland company. And I was like, this is going to be an amazing job. I had a interview with them. The interview went really good. And then they went with somebody who had an MBA because the job market was so poor, they could get those people. So I ended up selling e-cigarettes at the mall. And I think that's also something really like, I kind of joke around about it, but like understanding where other people's lives are coming from. Like I was a janitor for several years throughout college. Not because I had to be, but I just was. And being able to relate to other people and realize you're not above any job, right? Like a lot of people are in work that they shouldn't be in and they think they're above things, but really you're not. It's just for most of us, we hit the lottery just being born in America, right? Where you have a lot of opportunity. So you're already above everybody else. Not, I mean that in a way of opportunities, right? You have more opportunities at your hand. So one is just be humble, don't stress about things. But the other thing is just take every opportunity to learn and grow that you can. I mean, I've lived in Pennsylvania. I've lived in Ohio. I've lived in Illinois. I lived in South Dakota. I lived in China. I now live in Colorado. The world is much bigger than the 90-mile radius of where you grew up. Get yourself uncomfortable as fast as possible. And that's the other thing, Patrick. Like, I was pretty awkward as a kid. Throughout, I would say socially awkward throughout college too. There are some bad habits that I, picked up along the way, but and then how to make myself not awkward. But I just kind of grew out of it, and a lot of that was I would force myself into these situations, whether it was uncomfortable socially or whatever, And then I'm at a point in my life where I'm 100% comfortable who I am, 100% satisfied with my life. Just got married this last year. Have a dog. Like, life's pretty good. And I think a lot of that is because I was very open to all the opportunities that came my way. And the other thing I think that's also really important for people to know is be yourself. You don't have to be your 100% authentic self at every juncture. That's just not realistic. But my line of work, it was, a favorite interview question, which I always despised in sales is, tell me about like college and did you play any sports? Because they somehow correlate sports and athleticism to business, which you can make that argument. You can make that argument about a band. You can make that argument about, pretty much anything that requires coordination. And so about 6 months into my job at Salesforce, I started like just being really open on the phone with who I am, I like the Grateful Dead and Fish, and I was just kind of, I would approach things with humor and sincerity, and people really responded to that. And yeah, I know enough about football and hockey. I played hockey for 10 years of my life, but Patrick, I couldn't tell you when the last time I watched a football game. Like, you don't need to put yourself in a box to fit to a corporation or to sales or whatever. And I really do believe if you're honest and sincere, about who you are and approaching other people like that, I think you'll win out 9 times out of 10. Might not be in the short term, but, you'll put yourself in a really good position.
Yeah. So a couple of follow-ups on that. One of the things you pointed out for that advice, being your authentic self, like not being afraid to be yourself. I think it was like Bruce Lee is like, that's one of those things, like the hardest thing for people to do. And, I've dealt with that in my role because I deal with a lot of elected officials, and it's a highly political position in economic development between the public and the private sector. It can be difficult. But then also, you had mentioned earlier that you've had the multiple jobs and that no one's above anything. And I completely agree with that. I remember, I was in high school and they had to take all these subjects. And I was like, what does history have to do with algebra, with whatever? Like, I'll never use this. But I think what it allows you to do is start connecting the dots. And so I was a landscaper, I did roofing, I was bartending, and I swear I would not be in this role if I hadn't bartended for a decade, because I learned how to communicate with people on sometimes their best and their worst days. So communication side is huge. And then the other thing is like basically what you focus on will expand, and nothing has meaning except the meaning you give it. And I think that if you could have that mindset, then you probably can be your authentic self. But great advice on don't be afraid to try anything. I think that's one of the messages I'm trying to get out, especially to some of the younger people starting their career. Like, I don't care what it pays, go do it. I mean, it's better than, not taking a chance and looking back and being like, I wish I would have. So that's huge there. So when did you actually decide to, I guess, when and why transition to the master's program at Notre Dame?
So I cannot highlight how little of thought I put into, which was probably a mistake. But in all seriousness, so I'd been wanting to go further my education for a while, but knew a lot of people with MBAs, and I just wasn't really impressed. Like one, they're a couple fold. Unless, in my opinion, you're a CFO or, you're trying to get a job at a handful of companies that require people from like Harvard or some of these companies, it didn't really, I didn't really think it was worth it. And then a coworker of mine, he was actually in the, I think, second or third MSBA. And I really respect him. He was really smart. And he essentially said, that's really great. He overlined the course outline to me. And I said, how much time do you put into it a week? He's like, I don't know, like 4 or 5 hours. That was garbage advice because, when I applied and got in, I feel like I probably was one of the hardest workers in that class. I think I put 30 to 40 hours a week every week, for an entire year. And I don't, I think people like you and me, right? We came from a little bit of a background. Everybody, I would say 80% of our class was pretty mathematically or scientifically oriented or something. They were in a job where they were focused on a lot of the things that, quite frankly, Patrick, I don't think you and I were. And so that was a huge, huge learning curve for me. And I feel like I closed down about halfway into the program because I thought I was like internally embarrassed. And I really wish I wasn't the case because you guys were all really great, but I felt super intimidated. And then I found out later on that people were intimidated by some of the things I was saying. Like in the first, I don't know if we did semesters or whatever, but I was always very vocal, in class. And so I would say anybody, considering advancing their education or even just doing anything is you have to be an open book and you have to be willing to learn and fail. And I think I left some things on the table that I could have learned that I didn't. And I blame myself on that because I got too nervous. A great book, by the way, that everybody should read is Mindset by Dweck. It's one of my favorite books. I read it like once a year, and it's essentially talks about business, sports, academics, relationships, music, and it essentially shows and provides examples like people who are it says 95% of people have the ability to be experts in whatever field they want, right? Like you're never going to be a LeBron James. You're never going to be a Stephen Hawking. There's physical attributes, there's some level of genetics or mental gift, but for the 95%, and at the other end, right? Like if you're physically handicapped, probably not going to be an NBA player, or, you had a lot of concussions or a traumatic brain injury, probably going to be tough, right? Academically. But for 95% of the population, you can succeed. And that doesn't mean just financially. It just means you can become an expert. So I think that's something that's really, really important for people to understand. Like it's super okay to fail. Very, very, like everybody fails. You're not the smartest person in the room. People who think they are going to end up failing soon. They talk about Lee Iacocca and several executives, right, who they surrounded themselves by yes men. And in the long run, that doesn't work. The other thing, and, I'm sure Notre Dame wouldn't want to hear this, but I mean, it's a network, right? Like that was part of the other reason. It's like, I didn't want to go to, I wanted to be very selective about where I went and received my master's. Because I know that, somewhere down the line, for better or for worse, the network is going to be important, where you go to school. Notre Dame has a stellar reputation. And I was just like, this is a school that is close by me. It's like that, Northwestern, all great schools, right? they pretty much have the same pedigree in terms of status. And so that was another big contributor. And so when I went through class, I mean, I don't want to, sound ignorant, but like, I mean, I was super proud that I graduated at the bottom of the class. Like, I did it. My degree doesn't look any different from anybody else's. And I learned a lot. And I have really good friends from it. You don't like I struggled. I'd rather would have put myself in a position where I struggled with that and came out learning something academically and learning something about myself than to just gone to a lesser caliber of an institution and just shipped it in and, been at the top 10% of the class or whatever.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And actually the challenge of it too, it was in the beginning, I can't remember which assignment, but we were sitting there coding at one point, and I remember my daughter coming in and being like, "Oh, how's it going?" I'm like, "I think I'm on number 3 out of 9, and I'd been there for like 3 hours." I immediately had to text, I think it was like Austin or Vince. I'm like, where are you guys at with this? And everybody was on the same struggle. So then I didn't feel so bad. But you're right. Coming into it with a business background, I knew HTML code, but knew nothing about R, none statistics really. That wasn't my background. It was like marketing. I knew marketing really well, but I did not know everything that went into the coding or the math side of things. So I think that we did a good job of bridging that. But yeah, again, like you said, like intimidated by the program, I'd rather go through that struggle and, learn, like you said, about yourself. But also I learned a ton in that class. And again, how these things relate. But then also, I don't think Notre Dame would have any problem with you mentioning the power of the network and the alumni. I think that's one of the biggest selling points for that school. It was an amazing experience. I got a lot out of it. I use quite a bit of it still today. I don't code as much as probably Vince or Austin, or they probably have people coding for them. But it's still cool to see how that technology relates. And it just really opens your mind on what the possibilities are. So jumping back into post Notre Dame, still at Salesforce, like, can you just, because I know you're not there, but like, what was an average day? What did that look like for you in that role?
So I would say there's, no, no average day in it, but, to the best of my abilities kind of explain, like, one, if you're going into a role of sales, it's something that you really have to completely own, and it is what you make of it or what you don't. So you can have the luxury of going out and playing golf, playing hooky and stuff like that, but I don't think you're going to, make it very far if you kind of take that attitude. And just kind of going back, I give myself a lot of props now. Like, I remember flying back from customer meetings at like 4:30 a.m. from Memphis, landing in Chicago at 10 because there had to be a connecting flight, and then walking in to classroom at 11 to sit down and take a stats final. So I really busted my ass in that. But the way I kind of look at it is, and the way I would just, sum up, my job is I lead a team, right? Going back to the whole sports thing. I lead a team of probably about 30 people or so. And when I say that, I don't have hiring or firing authorities of them. Some of these people, they're technology folks, they're other salespeople. Some of them are executives, but, they're all in the same team. And I really lead that team. And so what my job is, and the way to really sum it up is, I like to know my customer's business front and back. I'm never going to be an expert in X industry, right? So I've been selling I've been selling to insurers for the last 4 years, some of the largest insurers in the world. I haven't spent 30 years in that industry. I'm not going to pretend that I did, or that I, know what day in the life of an actuary is, but I'm an expert, not in that industry, but I'm an expert in transforming businesses with technology. And a goal of mine is to understand the businesses I work with front and back. And so what that really entails is meeting with people at various levels of the companies, right? So I'd meet with CXOs all the way down to the very bottom employees and everywhere in between to understand what day in the life looked like, what challenges were. The best way I would do that, and the best way I found success, was understanding, what are the three key initiatives that executives want to accomplish in a given year, right? And then understanding how they can get there, whether it's they'll know some challenges, but you'll also understand some of those challenges, or you'll uncover those challenges and then you present them back to us. So a lot of that is, if I could put it out in a calendar of a year, the first quarter of a given year, you are building relationships, understanding what those projects should be. Quarters 2 and 3, you're really formulating that plan, the business value case, demonstrations to them. And then Q4 is really just trying to get it done. So you've got a variety of different things of prospecting, outreach, which is the number one biggest pain. I have a lot of friends who, just because, last time you talked to them, Vince, Austin, Sean. Sean played both sides of the fence. He was a sales guy too. But, Vince and Austin are sales engineers, which phenomenal, talented people. They are partial sales, but what they don't do is they're not the people who are banging down the doors, trying to get a meeting with somebody for 9 months, right? I just, I'd been prospecting this one woman, the CMO, for 18 months, and I finally got a meeting with her 2 weeks ago, right? And so it's a lot of doing research on your customers, research on their competitors, outreach, scheduling meetings, coordinating plans, overcoming objections. Storytelling is huge. We go back to Patrick, like one of the things that I would say you and I had a leg up on. Most of the people in our classroom, when they entered it, I don't think they could talk to people in front of a classroom. That's a really big skill set to have. And that's one of the things, if you look at leaders of businesses, most of those people have some sort of a sales background, right? Being able to understand business. You don't have to understand technology to do my job. It helps. I personally think of myself a blend between a salesperson and a technology expert, because that's how I'm comfortable. Like, I'm very good at in the weeds with a lot of different technologies. And I think that's what the MSBA did really important. That was really important for me. I mean, when I was going through that and after, CIOs look at me entirely different when I share that with them. I'm not somebody who puts a tagline, Peter Topa, MSBA, right? But I'll bring it up at appropriate times, and they really respect that. I'm also one of the few people I know who has conversations in their professional career with PhDs of data science and statistics, because those people are being lifted up and empowered now more at these organizations. And I can speak their language. I can speak super technical languages. I could also dumb it down to an executive, right? And then you don't have to dumb it down to an executive, but you know what I mean. I meet people where they're at and how they understand things. And I think that's one of the ways I've been very successful, relatable to people. I build really strong connections. I deliver value.
I think that is a skill that I don't know if we can emphasize enough. I mean, we talked about, the public speaking side, the communication side. I almost say the translation side, being able to take something complicated and you have to say dumb it down. It's just simplifying it so that other people can understand it in their own, meet them where they're at. That's massive. So out of all the stuff that you learned, I guess, maybe not in high school, but maybe, when you're originally going to school and college, was there any knowledge that you applied, for your job, or was it more experience-based?
I think it was more experience-based, and I fundamentally have problems with educational institutions in the United States. Full stop. I wish people there are some people, like if you're a surgeon, yes, by all means, go to school for 12 years. Most people should have 12 to 24 months of an education. There's a lot of wasted money, wasted time, and lost earning powers for most people to go to school. And I think experience base is really where you're at. I mean, there's a handful of schools that like have sales programs, but the best thing you could do is actually go out there, cold call people, right? And do it. I'm of the mindset, not to reuse that term, but I think in my job, as well as pretty much my philosophy in life, like I need to be introspective enough to understand what type of a person I am, what my approach, like what type of a selling person I am, and what are my gaps and how do I fix those gaps? You need to be honest with yourself, not sugarcoat it, right? And just be brutally honest about how you change things. I had a lot of neurological issues growing up, right? Which we'll dive into, but a longer term side effect of that was some cognitive issues. And a lot of it was related to logical sequences and storytelling. I think 99% of the people wouldn't notice that about me, but like when I get tired and things, I still see some of these issues surface. One of the ways I solved this, or I worked on this, is, and I would say safe harbor here, check the legality of the state you're in. But when I would be doing cold calls, in my first job in Ohio, I would keep my phone on here and I would have it be recording. So I could hear myself, how I'm interacting, how I'm pitching people when I'm doing a presentation, play it back. And that's one of the ways how I self-taught how I improved myself, right? So, I mean, there's between that, like I said, going back to being your authentic self, I felt identifying that early on, how will I best relate to Patrick Hoban? How will I gain credibility and sell him something, right? They're not ugly words. I think a lot of time people view salespeople through a bad lens. And there are certainly bad salespeople. There are people who don't care. When I was leaving my employer, I talked to several executives and they were like, you 100% put your all into this. You cared about our outcomes and we'll 100% be a reference for you, in the next chapter of your life. And we want to work with you again. I don't know if there's a ton of salespeople who get that feedback, but I mean, I'm super proud that I get that. I got that. And kind of goes back to school and networking too, and philanthropy. You can do good for others, but also being realistic about what that's going to bring to you down the line. So for instance, I've always gone above and beyond to help people out, not like impacting my job or whatever, but I would take on extra loads to make sure people were ramped up, or I did this, or, I did a fundraiser, right? And I did that, one, because I cared, but two is because I know that down the line, when I need a favor or help or whatever, I can call a ton of people up and they'll want to help me out because I was there for them when they struggle, right? And so I know that's kind of meandering, but it's, you don't have to, you're not defined by your job. You can define what type of person you are. And then you don't have to be utterly selfish. There is a lot of selfishness to being selfless. There 100% is, and it's not bad. Helping people and realizing the benefit you're going to get from that, it's a good thing. That's the way the world works.
No, you dropped a whole bunch of knowledge bombs in there. So there's going to be plenty to cut up and drop into snippets for different reels, depending on where people are at. But no, I completely agree. Like the pay it forward mindset, it's going to come back around. And yeah, I wouldn't think there's a lot of people employer wise that, when that does happen, that they're going to be in your corner and, want you to come back. So that's awesome that you got that. And actually, good time to transition. I guess what's next? Like, what are your aspirations? If you can go a little bit deeper.
Yeah. So, I mean, short-term aspirations, my wife and I, we've decided to do some extensive traveling, over the next 6 months or a year. And kind of goes a little bit back to a lot of different things, Patrick, like what you see growing up, what you see moving in the future and wanting to just take advantage of things. We've seen a lot of people not be able to do things for health, finances, whatever you want to call it. So we're going to take this next year to just see the world. I have, objectives myself that I want to accomplish. I want to become foundationally proficient in Portuguese. My wife's Brazilian, so study that. I also want to continue studying my knowledge of AI as well as other technologies. And I'm going to teach myself, how to high-level code like Python and a couple other languages. I just want to start wireframing some apps for fun, maybe for professional uses. But as it relates to generative AI, because there's a lot of ideas I've had that actually have been put into practice, which is cool to see, but I want to see if I can own some of those. And so that's the short term. Longer term, kind of, it's really not set, right? And it's one of these things where, to use another sports quote, everybody's got a plan until they get hit in the face, right? I will not be watching that broadcast this Friday. I will not. I do not. I really don't like the one guy that's on there. But, I mean, I'll probably come back in similar arenas, right? W2ing, from a technology perspective at, a player, a tech player. But there's a lot of entrepreneurial things that, I want to accomplish too. So I think this is a good time to do some contract work and, try to go down the line with that when I get back. Thankfully, we're in a pretty fortunate position where, we can take the year off and everything. And I think that also goes back to when you're young, like not taking your eyes off of the future, right? Save, invest, plan, don't live beyond your means, all of that stuff. America really doesn't work like that. America loves debt. If you want to live like that, that's fine. A lot of salespeople live like that. But yeah, I mean, I think the biggest, and two, I know this is this is a few different reasons, right, that you're having this podcast, but like outside of, like, I would say the couple big things I would tell people is outside of you're not above anything, right? You're not above any job, but understanding how business works, how to talk to people. And then two, or the last one would be like financial literacy, being smart with your finances, right? And you can be like, you go on Reddit, you watch The Big Short, you watch anything, like if you start at a young age and just continue to build, right? There's a lot of things that are attainable. One of these things in the world, when nothing costs anything, different conversation. But the world we live in, things cost money. You should 100% be educated and pay attention to how financial institutions work.
Yeah, it's always amazing, like how much technology and access to information and knowledge we have in our pocket, and knowing how much is even available on YouTube for financial literacy. That's a solid advice for people earlier on to invest. And, speaking about some dollars, and I'm assuming, are you still in the city of Chicago?
No, I actually moved down to Denver about 3 years ago.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, no, we had talked about that. So let's get into Denver a little bit. I mean, so it's kind of funny talking to you. Like, I think everyone's moved since we've graduated. Vince had moved down to Texas too. So what do you like about Denver? And I guess, what do you miss about Chicago?
Yeah. It's easy. It's food and entertainment. I mean, Chicago has some of the best food, probably, I mean, at least in the United States, but I mean, it's definitely a food capital of the world. Chicago often gets whatever magazine you're reading, right? There's a lot, but in many magazines, Chicago beats out New York and LA and these other food hubs in the US. So I would say food and entertainment proximity are probably the things that I miss. But what drew me to leaving Chicago a lot was one, it was just COVID, but just understanding what was important to me. I would always fly to Colorado to go skiing. I'd fly to Washington to go hike with my friends. I would go fishing up in Canada, up in Quebec, a couple times a year with my dad. And so Denver and Colorado offers all of that. As far as like a quality of life, what type of city it is, it's not a bad city. Like there's a good sushi place, there's a good Indian place. You're not going to have Devon Street, right? From a food perspective, it's getting a lot better. We were just awarded a couple Michelin restaurants this last year. From a city and infrastructure standpoint, I do believe it's struggling a little bit in trying to, find its identity and balancing out some of the politics of the day, which we won't go into necessarily, but like housing is a major issue here, right? And there's a huge housing boom. I think there's a lot of great opportunities to own investment properties. I know certain people have very strong feelings about that, but it is a growing city and there's a lot of great opportunities. This is one of the biggest startup hubs, specifically in tech in the US. So there's a lot of really good talent. What I see as being an issue in technology and employment is wages here are still compressed. It's really funny that they do, cost of talent does not relate to the census and what the economic output, right? So the short of it is they can hire, they have tier A, tier B, tier C cities for pay. San Francisco, New York are tier 1, tier A. Chicago, Seattle, and probably Washington, D.C. are tier 2, tier B, whatever you want to call it. Denver's tier 3, even though we have Databricks, ServiceNow. Like you look at the market, ServiceNow, phenomenal growth in the last couple of years. But yet, employers still can hire people for lower wages here, which I don't agree with, but that's the way the world works. It just doesn't compute with the housing prices. Like housing is so much more expensive here than in Chicago. Flip side, you have much higher taxes in Chicago. But if you were to buy a house here, like I do empathize with a lot of folks on just the unaffordability of housing in general. The good is, it's a playground. You don't have enough time for hobbies. I've got mountain bikes, I've got road bikes, I have 4 snowboards, I have fishing rods, there's so many things to do and so little time to do it. So that's really good about it. It is increasingly getting, better food. The music scene here is great, even though I haven't really dove into it the last couple of years. I think COVID kind of kicked my Chicago concert going to the curb a little bit. I used to go a ton, and just quite frankly, like Ticketmaster, it's getting out of hand with what you have to spend. But yeah, there's great entertainment. We saw Hamilton here. So music, entertainment, better food quality is getting better. Access. What's not good is some affordability, some of the wage things. And then I would say what the biggest thing for my wife and I is, I wouldn't call myself an East Coaster. I grew up in Western PA, but she lived in Philly for 8 years. Driving to Albuquerque was 7 hours, right? Like you live in Pittsburgh, you can drive to Cleveland in 2 hours. You can drive to Philly in 5. There's not a lot of places, a lot of other cities to drive to. So that can be a bummer, in itself. But on the plus side, Like we just did a 1,800-mile road trip. We drove to Vegas. We drove to the Grand Canyon. We drove to Lake Powell. We drove up to Moab. Then we drove back to Denver. Landscapes will blow you away if you've never been to Utah. We went to the Forrest Gump area, which is in Monument National Road or Monument National Park in Utah. It was just phenomenal.
So that's it's interesting about the everybody wants to live there, and I think it probably goes to the environmental psychology of the place. It's absolutely gorgeous, and so you get an influx of people, which drives up the price of the housing. But then also, if you got that many people, then the wages don't catch up. And I wonder how many people, and it's probably within the census. And yeah, the census is delayed, so it's definitely not caught up to what some of the wages would be. But like what that outflow actually is from some of the major metros. I knew it was an issue in New York, Chicago for sure, as people are looking for more space, like post-pandemic, and actually reprioritizing their lives and what mattered to them. So yeah, I'm glad you found that. And it's something where I can appreciate, but I also can't recreate. So as I'm looking at economic development, like how do you, I guess, figure out a way to beautify your community? Like I'm not moving mountains, like you're not doing handmade lakes anymore or waterways. But is there anything that you would say architecturally wise or public spaces that are in the area that you enjoy?
That's a good one. Like, so here's my perspective, and this isn't just related to Denver, Colorado. And I hate it because I always have to caveat, like, this isn't my opinion. Like, this is pretty basic information. COVID, money was super cheap. I think a lot of people wanted to have this idealistic vision of wanting to have a second home or a third home. And they're like, I want to become a mountain person. And I think a lot of people now are realizing, so Denver's transient in nature. I would say a challenge has been to retain friends because a lot of people move in and out. When you're nearing 40, that less fun to go out and meet friends, right? But I think that you're going to have this snap back a little bit. I think Denver has had a lot of people moving to it. I think a lot of people are going to, I wouldn't say move out of Denver, but the people are going to realize, hey, I'm not really an outdoors person. I think you're going to have a lot of people saying that. I also think you're going to have some of these people who drove up prices by buying a second home or a third home. It's a very, very complex issue. I mean, housing prices suck. I mean, they do. And I doubt they're going to fall nationwide by a substantial amount. I don't think we're going to have another 2008, but there needs to be much more affordable housing, because if there's not affordable housing, you're not going to have people be able to work and support these communities. I mean, it's as simple as that,
Housing is an issue. And I think until there is more supply, so I know that had a change in presidency and they'll probably be looking at different types of incentives, but there's got to be a way, I'd say, to either incentivize or lower the interest rate for borrowers who are in the builder side of things. Because if we don't have the supply side, we can talk about incentives for home buyers, but that just increases demand. The demand's already there. And so we have to figure out how to get more product online, whether that is the cities, helping out with incentives, or nationally, offering a lower interest rate for builders. I mean, at the end of the day, you got to have more product because it's a simple supply and demand.
Yeah. And so that actually narrows the scope a little bit. So building in Denver is phenomenally expensive. One of the things that came out in the last 48 hours or week, I hadn't heard him talk about it before, but, Trump had cited that 25% of the cost of a new home is related to the regulations and getting everything approved, right? Denver, I think that's very clear in Denver, where in the last 2 years, they raised a ton of taxes on developers. They said no to people having ADUs, which is additional dwelling units. So like a little micro house in your backyard. And now they're totally flipping the script on that a year and a half later. They're actually now incentivizing people to have ADUs, where they just banned them a year and a half ago. So it's supply and demand, it's regulation, right? You don't want people to get screwed over, but there's a fine balance between loose regulation and enough regulation to make sure people have houses that are stable, that are affordable, but the wiring is also correct.
No, you're right. That the whole ADU concept, I'll put a link in the show notes to this, but there's it's a concept that's called the missing middle. And so like even here in Bloomington Normal, we got really good at building big single family 5-bedroom homes on golf courses, then also student housing. And that missing middle is that product. And one of the ways that people have figured out how to do that is with the ADU concept. So yeah, again, it goes back to product. Regulation is definitely an issue. It just depends on where you're at, on how much regulation there is. If it's a super popular area, they start to become more and more regulated because they can pick and choose like what materials. I remember in Tinley Park, everything there, first floor had to be brick. That's in their requirement. And I'm like, that's wild. It doesn't matter commercial, residential, anything. It's all got to be brick on the first floor, and you drive around, you see it. But that increases the cost. So regulation becomes an issue. But if you want to encourage development, some of that's got to drop off. So that makes sense, especially in an area like yours that was growing so fast. Actually, you know what? We just hit an hour somehow. Is there any other final talking points that you wanted to hit before we jump off here? Like any other advice you'd throw back at yourself?
I mean, I think the biggest thing in this is just advice to everybody is you're responsible and you're in control for your own future. I feel like a lot of the times people can beat themselves up, on situation, the hands they were dealt, whatever. Those are hurdles. Everybody's going to have hurdles. And I'm not trying to paint an easy picture that everybody's going to live an easy life. But if you want something enough, you can do it, but you also just have to. I think the first step is defining what do you think you want? What's going to make you happy in life? Is it going to be an insane work-life balance? Is it going to be $10 million? Is it going to be having a family? Is it going to be travel? You need to figure that out for yourself and then just be relentless, in that pursuit and how you want to live.
Solid advice. Because I mean, all the problems are relative. Like you're always gonna have problems. Sometimes they get easier, sometimes they're harder. And you did mention earlier on, which I did like, is that, things might seem really hard and there's going to be challenges, but it's going to work itself out. So I don't know if it was Elon Musk or maybe it was, he figured out he could live off of $5 a day. And as soon as he did that, he just did whatever the heck he wanted to. And he's obviously still doing whatever he wants. I'm not saying take his advice, but things tend to work themselves out. Either way, you're going to get through it. And if not, like literally, like we both experienced loss earlier on in life. And you might as well live in the moment, take advantage of what you got, because eat every meal like it's your last. I read that the other day. And now every time I take a bite, I'm like, I shouldn't scarf this thing down. You should enjoy it. Well, with that, I'll go and wrap things up. But thanks so much for sharing some advice, and I'll get this thing edited and drop it online. So let me exit out of this and stop it.